Dear listeners, tonight we bring you a gripping tale of deception, secrets, and a mystery that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Prepare yourself for a journey into the unknown, where every shadow hides a secret, and every whisper carries a clue. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The Widow's Secret is a chilling story of hidden truths, and the darkness lurking behind the most familiar faces. The tale unfolds in a quiet town where appearances deceive, and trust is a dangerous illusion. Much like the timeless stories of Agatha Christie, this narrative explores the unsettling idea that the greatest threats often lie closest to home. Set in the tense period following the Great War, when suspicion and fear gripped society, this story delves into the fragile bonds of loyalty and the unsettling realization that those we love may not be who they seem. The slow and insidious nature of poison plays a crucial role in this mystery, a silent killer that leaves no trace until it is too late. With its intricately woven plot and unsettling realism, this tale mirrors the way true crime often seeps into everyday life, disguised in the ordinary. The Widow's Secret, Mrs. Whitmore, announced the housekeeper in a hushed tone before retreating into the shadows. Detective Arthur Graves had encountered all kinds of clients in his time, but as he watched the woman step tentatively into his dimly lit office, he knew this was different. Mrs. Whitmore was not a woman one would expect to be tangled in intrigue. She was plain, with weary eyes that held an unspoken burden, her hands clutched tightly around the edges of her well-worn shawl. The scent of lavender clung to her, masking something more bitter, something almost chemical. The way she hesitated at the threshold, as if second-guessing her own presence, sent a ripple of unease through the air. She was the kind of woman you might pass in the marketplace without a second glance, yet tonight she stood before him, afraid, uncertain, and desperate. Graves leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Please, Mrs. Whitmore, take a seat. You seem troubled." She hesitated, eyes darting to the shadows in the corners of the room, before finally sinking into the chair. "You are Detective Graves?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "At your service, madam." The silence stretched, her fingers twisted the lace of her sleeve, her lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but the words refused to come. The weight of whatever she carried was suffocating. "You must tell me everything," Graves prompted. "I don't know if I should have come," she stammered, "but I had no one else. The police, they wouldn't believe me." He gave her an encouraging nod. "Start from the beginning." Mrs. Whitmore drew a sharp breath, her gaze fixed on the flickering candlelight. "It's my husband. He's been dead for 5 years, and yet, last night, I heard his voice whispering my name. I don't want the police involved. My business is private, strictly private." The words barely left her lips before she clasped a trembling hand to her mouth, as if afraid she had already said too much. Mrs. Evelyn Hargrove leaned forward in the dimly lit room, her frail frame wrapped tightly in a woolen shawl. Though the evening was not particularly cold, her eyes darted around, flickering toward the darkened corners, as if expecting someone, something to be lurking there, listening. The sheer weight of her fear was almost tangible. "Private," she repeated in a whisper. "That's exactly what I need. No fuss, no headlines, no whispers in the marketplace, the things they write in the papers, the way they twist words. Once a family's name is dragged through that filth, there's no reclaiming it." She swallowed hard, her voice growing unsteady. "And what if I'm wrong? What if I'm accusing an innocent man? My own husband?" Her voice wavered, the last word barely audible. Detective James Alden studied her carefully. He had seen fear before, but this was different. This was terror laced with doubt, the kind that gnawed at a person from the inside out. "You suspect your husband," he stated calmly. "Of what?" Mrs. Hargrove hesitated, twisting a worn handkerchief in her fingers. "I don't want to say it. I can't." She closed her eyes briefly, as if willing herself to stop, but then, in a barely audible murmur, she spoke. "But you read of these things, don't you? Wives unaware, victims, blind to the truth until it's too late." Alden remained silent, letting the words settle. The pause stretched until, finally, he said, "You must speak freely, madam. If your fears are unfounded, imagine the relief. But if they hold weight, then surely you must know the danger you are in." Her breath quickened. "That's just it. The uncertainty is unbearable. Every meal I eat feels like a gamble. My body aches, my stomach turns, and yet, when my husband is away, I feel fine. She inhaled sharply. Even my maid, Clara, has noticed. And then, there's that bottle. Alden raised an eyebrow. What bottle? In the study, she whispered. A bottle of rat poison. The gardener says no one has used it, and yet, it's half empty. The room fell into a heavy silence, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. Alden exhaled slowly, and reached for his notepad. Let's begin from the start, madam. Tell me everything. Ravenshire, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. A quiet market town on the coast. Nothing much ever happens there. Detective Alden noted the way her fingers clutched at the fabric of her shawl, twisting and wringing, as though she could squeeze the tension from her bones. And you have lived there long? He asked. 18 years, she answered. Long enough to know every street, every neighbor, long enough to feel the walls closing in. Alden nodded, jotting down a note. Your household consists of just you and your husband. Yes, no children, no, just the two of us. She hesitated then, a flicker of something unreadable passing over her face before she added, my husband's niece, Isabel, she's lived with us for nearly a decade, that is until last week. And what happened a week ago? A muscle in her jaw tightened. She left, walked out the door, and didn't look back. We had been clashing for months. She had changed, become secretive, sharp-tongued, unpredictable. I barely recognized her anymore, and then one evening, after a particularly terrible argument, she simply packed her things and vanished into town, took a room of her own. I haven't seen her since. Alden leaned forward slightly. And your husband, what does he think? Henry says to let her go. She'll come to her senses, he tells me. Give her time, but time only makes the silence louder. She hesitated before adding, Mr. Vance agrees with him. Alden caught the subtle shift in her tone. Mr. Vance. A faint flush crept up her neck. A friend, just a friend, a kind man. He listens. And Isabel, did she share the same fondness for this Mr. Vance? Her response was swift, too swift. Of course not. There was nothing between them. Alden let the moment stretch, watching her carefully. Then smoothly, he changed course. You and your husband, financially stable, I presume. She exhaled, as if relieved by the shift in questioning. Yes, we have more than enough. But there was something in the way she said it, a certain weight, as if money itself had become just another piece of the growing tension in the house. Alden tapped his pen against the notebook. The puzzle pieces were shifting into place, but the picture they formed was still uncertain. Tell me, Mrs. Hargrove, what is it you're truly afraid of? And the money? Alden's voice was measured, careful. Does it belong to you, or to your husband? Across from him, Margaret Hargrove clenched her hands together, the knuckles turning pale. It's his, every penny. Alden made a note, his pen gliding smoothly over the paper. You understand, madam, that to solve a crime, one must be brutally honest. Motives are rarely built on mere inconvenience. Your husband, he wouldn't poison you just to pass the time. He lifted his gaze to meet hers. So tell me, does he have a reason? Margaret's face darkened, a rare flicker of anger breaking through her worry. The woman, she spat, that little blonde wretch, he keeps in his shop. Alden raised an eyebrow. My husband is a doctor, you see, a fine respectable man in the eyes of the town, and yet he insists on hiring that girl, a slip of a thing, barely out of her teeth, with bobbed hair, and a coy little smile. She makes the patients comfortable, he says. She's efficient, quick with the appointments, keeps the place tidy. Tidy, indeed. She let out a sharp breath. I know what I've heard, detective. I know what people whisper when they think I'm not listening. And what do they whisper? That he lingers in the shop after hours, that she stays behind too, that there are rumors. She swallowed hard. Of course he swears it's nonsense, that he's a faithful man devoted to me, but men lie.
Oh, don't they?
Alden tapped his pen against the desk. This bottle of poison.
One you suspect.
She stiffened. The weed killer. He ordered it, said we needed it for the garden. That was a year ago, and yet the gardener swears he's never touched it. But I checked the bottle last week. She paused, lowering her voice. It's half empty. Alden took another note, then asked, and your niece? Does she have any money of her own? A small inheritance, £50 a year maybe, but not enough to live comfortably, not unless she, Margaret trailed off. Unless she what, madame? Unless she took my place. The words hung in the air, thick with implication. If I were to disappear, she'd have everything. The house, the name, a role to step into, and my husband, he wouldn't be alone. Alden leaned back slightly. Have you considered leaving him? Her lips pressed into a thin line. I won't be cast aside like an old shoe, detective. Not for some slip of a girl. Not for anyone. I admire your determination, madame, Alden said smoothly. But let's be practical. You are returning to Ravenshire today. She nodded. Yes. Came by the morning train, and I'll take the last one home. Alden set his notebook aside, steepling his fingers. Then allow me to assist. I have no pressing matters at hand, and your case intrigues me. By tomorrow I shall be in Ravenshire as well. My companion, Mr. Clark, will pose as a distant cousin of yours, while I, he allowed a slight smirk, shall be his eccentric foreign friend. Margaret let out a shaky breath, relief flickering in her eyes. Until then, madame, be cautious. Prepare your own meals. Trust no one, not even those under your own roof. A shadow passed over her face, and for the first time that evening, she looked truly afraid. Miss Palmer is a very efficient girl, I'm sure. Alden rose from his chair, offering a polite nod, as Margaret Hargrove hesitated at the doorway. Until tomorrow then, madame. And do have courage. He watched as she stepped out, her shoulders still stiff with tension. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving a lingering silence in the room. Alden remained still for a moment, his gaze dropping to the floor. Then, with a deliberate slowness, he leaned forward. His sharp eyes caught the delicate strands, tiny wisps of feather, torn from her scarf in her agitated grip. Carefully he plucked them up, rolling them between his fingers before discarding them into the wastepaper basket. A trivial detail to some, to Alden, a whisper of something deeper. Across the room, Clark exhaled, breaking the silence. What do you make of it? He asked, his voice edged with intrigue. Alden settled back into his chair, steepling his fingers. A rather unpleasant matter, to be sure. You believe her suspicions? Alden murmured, his eyes gleaming with something unreadable. That is the question, my friend. A troubling thing indeed for a man to order a bottle of poison, and when his wife falls ill, mysteriously, progressively, well, the conclusion writes itself, does it not? Clark frowned. You think she's mistaken then? Alden tapped his fingers on the desk, his thoughts running deeper than he let on. What I think, Clark, is that this case is remarkably unremarkable. There is not a single element we have not encountered before. A woman feeling unwell, a husband, distant, a servant, conveniently positioned, a bottle of poison, half used and unaccounted for. He paused, tilting his head slightly. And yet, does Mrs. Hargrove strike you as a hysterical woman? Clark considered. No. She seems grounded, frightened, but rational. Alden smiled, satisfied. Precisely. And that is what makes this fascinating. A woman who does not indulge in hysterics, yet finds herself consumed by a suspicion so grim, she breaks her silence. A wife who should, by all means, stand by her husband, and yet, he trailed off, lost in thought. Loyalty struggling with fear, Clark mused. Alden nodded, though his expression remained unreadable. Ordinarily, my friend, a woman will accuse anyone, before she dares to suspect her own husband. But Mrs. Hargrove, she has already broken that most sacred of trusts. The question is, why? For a long moment, the two men sat in silence, the weight of the mystery pressing in around them, and somewhere, far from that dimly lit room, a woman lay awake in the dark, listening to the steady ticking of a clock, wondering whether the next meal set before her might just be her last. The other woman complicates the matter. Clark exhaled, tapping his fingers against the armrest. The lamplight flickered in the dimly lit room, casting shifting shadows on the walls. Yes, Alden agreed. Affection, when poisoned by jealousy, can twist into hatred. But a woman scorned, she would go to the police. She would demand a reckoning, a scandal. And yet, Mrs. Hargrove. He shook his head. No, she came to me. Clark frowned. You think she wants her suspicions disproven? Alden's lips pressed into a thin line. Or perhaps, he mused, she wants them confirmed. A silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Alden leaned back, his gaze distant. There is something here I do not yet understand. A missing piece in the puzzle. Could she be deceiving me? Is she a masterful actress? He let the question hang, then shook his head. No, she was genuine. I would swear to it. He straightened, suddenly brisk. Look up the trains to Hawksworth. The best train of the day was the 1:50 from Paddington, arriving in the remote town of Hawksworth just past 7. The journey was uneventful, the rhythmic clatter of wheels against the track lulling Clark into a restless slumber. When the train hissed to a halt, the station stood eerily quiet under a blanket of mist. Alden nudged Clark. Awake, we've arrived. The two men collected their bags and walked through the near-deserted platform, their footsteps echoing against the worn wooden planks. Outside, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and salt, a sign that the sea was not far. They took a room at the Blackwood Inn, a modest but clean establishment, and after a light supper, Alden set down his tea with quiet decisiveness. We pay our visit tonight. Clark glanced at the clock. An after-dinner call. Won't that seem unusual? Alden smiled faintly. Surprise often yields the truest reactions, my friend. The Hargrove house stood at the end of a narrow lane, its silhouette barely discernible against the night sky. A garden, wild and overgrown, stretched before it, the scent of jasmine and damp wood hanging in the cool air. Fireflies flickered amidst the tangled branches, their glow too delicate, too serene for the dread that curled in Clark's stomach. Alden rang the bell. Silence. He rang again, sharper this time. The door creaked open a fraction. A woman stood in the dim light, her apron askew, strands of hair falling loose from her bun. Her red-rimmed eyes darted between them, and when she spoke, her voice was thick, trembling. You shouldn't have come. Clark felt the hairs on his arms rise. Alden, however, remained composed, his gaze unreadable. Something has happened. The woman swallowed hard. Mrs. Hargrove. Her voice broke. She's dead. We wish to see Mrs. Hargrove. Alden said smoothly, his voice calm but firm. May we enter? The maid's eyes widened, her face pale in the dim light of the doorway. There was something raw in her expression. Shock, yes, but something else too. Fear. You haven't heard then. Her voice was hushed, but the words struck like a hammer. She's dead. Passed not half an hour ago. Alden and Clark froze. Dead? Clark echoed, his mind scrambling for some rationality amidst the sudden turn of events. What did she die of? The maid hesitated, casting a furtive glance over her shoulder before stepping forward, lowering her voice. There's some that could tell, she muttered, but they won't, not out loud anyhow. Alden's sharp gaze didn't miss the way her fingers gripped the doorframe, knuckles white. What are you saying? He pressed. I'm saying, the maid continued, voice unsteady, if it weren't for the fact someone ought to stay and watch over the missus, I'd be out of this house tonight, but I won't leave her alone. No, not while she lays cold upstairs. A shudder rippled through her, and she glanced around once more before whispering, it ain't my place to speak, but everyone in town knows, and if Mr. Radnor doesn't write to the Home Secretary, someone... Radnor? What's he got to do with it? The maid straightened, and for the first time, there was anger in her voice. The doctor can say what he likes, she spat, but I saw it with my own eyes. The master, her voice hitched, I saw him tonight, in the pantry, reaching up, taking down the bottle of weed killer, and when he turned and saw me standing there, watching him, he jumped like a guilty man. He did. A long silence stretched between them. And the food? Alden finally asked, his voice quiet. The maid swallowed hard. The Mrs. Gruel was already on the table, steaming, waiting for her. I'll not touch a bite in this house, not if I die for it. Alden turned, face unreadable. Clark saw it though, the ghost of something rare in his expression. Regret. Where does the doctor live? Alden asked. Dr. Adams, the maid answered without hesitation. High Street, second house round the corner. Without another word, Alden stepped away. Clark followed, glancing back once to see the maid standing in the doorway, her shadow stretching long and thin against the floor. Halfway down the street, Clark broke the silence. For a girl who wasn't going to say anything, she certainly said plenty. Alden didn't respond at first. Then in a voice tight with anger, he murmured, "A fool. That is what I have been, Clark. A blind, reckless fool." And for the first time, Clark wondered if they were already too late. "I have boasted of my little grey cells," Alden murmured, his voice edged with uncharacteristic bitterness. "And yet I have failed. A human life, one that sought me out, pleading to be saved, is lost. And why? Because I did not believe." He exhaled sharply, eyes dark with self-reproach. "May God forgive me, but I never thought anything would happen. Not so soon, not like this." The weight of his words hung between us as we reached the doctor's residence, a modest, neatly kept house. Its windows glowed with warm yellow light, a stark contrast to the cold dread seeping into my bones. Dr. Adams, the quintessential country physician, round, red-faced and exuding an air of jovial authority, greeted us with polite indifference. But the moment our purpose became clear, his pleasant demeanor hardened, his face darkened to an alarming shade of purple. Damned nonsense, every word of it," he bellowed, slamming his fist onto his desk. "Wasn't I the one attending to her? Gastritis, pure and simple. This town is a nest of gossiping old hens, always looking for a scandal. Give them a newspaper story about poisonings in London, and suddenly they see murder at every dinner table." His eyes flashed with fury. "A bottle of weed killer on a shelf, and suddenly Edward Pengelly is a villain. The man wouldn't hurt a fly, let alone poison his wife. Why would he, for God's sake? Tell me that." Alden's expression didn't change. His voice was quiet but firm. "There is one thing, Doctor, that perhaps you do not know." And then in crisp, measured words, he recounted Mrs. Hargrove's visit, the trembling hands, the whispered fears, the desperate plea for help. He spoke without embellishment, letting the gravity of the situation settle into the silence that followed. Dr. Adams sat motionless, his bluster fading into stunned disbelief. His eyes, once fierce, now darted wildly as if searching for an explanation. "Good Lord," he breathed. "The poor woman must have been mad. Why on earth didn't she come to me?" Alden's gaze was steady. To have her fears dismissed, to be told she was imagining things, to be made to feel foolish. Dr. Adams bristled. "Nonsense. I hope I have more of an open mind than that." But his voice lacked conviction, and I couldn't help but wonder, if Mrs. Hargrove had come to him, would she still be alive? The silence between us was deafening. Alden regarded the doctor with an almost amused detachment, a knowing glint in his eyes. "He is a stubborn man, Hastings," he murmured, as we stepped out into the cold night air. "He has declared it to be gastritis, and so gastritis it shall remain. Yet, did you notice, his hands trembled ever so slightly, his voice wavered just at the end. Oh, he is uneasy, mon ami, very uneasy indeed." The streets of the quiet town stretched before us, silent yet heavy with unseen whispers. The air was thick with the scent of damper earth and dying autumn leaves, and the darkness pressed in around us like an unspoken warning. "And what now?" I asked, though I had little hope of immediate action. "Now," Alden said with exaggerated solemnity, "we return to the inn and endure a night of horror upon one of your English provincial beds. Ah, the torment, the wooden frame that creaks like the cries of a dying man, the mattress that defies all comfort. Such is the misery of an English bed." I sighed. "And tomorrow? Tomorrow? Rien à faire. We must return to town and await developments." "That's it?" I asked, incredulous. "That's your grand plan? Wait, my dear Hastings," Alden said patiently. "Have I not always told you that patience is the key to revelation? The doctor may write his certificates and protest until he is blue in the face, but he cannot silence an entire town. Gossip is a fire, mon ami. It spreads, it consumes, and in its embers the truth will be found. Mark my words, before long, tongues will wag, and when they do—" He paused, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "We shall be ready to listen." A gust of wind howled down the empty street, rattling the shutters of the darkened houses. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled, its eerie cry lingering in the air. I pulled my coat tighter around me, but it was not the cold that sent a shiver down my spine. Alden's certainty unsettled me. He had promised that something would happen. The question was, when it did, would we be too late? Our train to town was scheduled for 11, but Poirot, ever meticulous, insisted on a final visit to Miss Freda Stanton, the niece of the late Mrs. Pengelly. We found her lodgings without difficulty, a modest but well-kept house tucked away on a quiet lane. As we knocked, the door was opened by a striking young woman with dark hair, vivid eyes, and a flush of color in her cheeks, undeniably of the old Cornish stock. Yet there was something guarded about her expression, something that spoke of an inner storm barely concealed beneath politeness. Beside her stood a tall, dark-haired man, his sharp gaze assessing us warily. Miss Stanton hesitated before introducing him. "This is Mr. Jacob Radnor," she said, almost too quickly. Her fingers twitched at the hem of her sleeve. Radnor inclined his head but said nothing. Poirot, ever the observer, let his eyes linger on the young man for a fraction longer than was necessary, before turning to Miss Stanton. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, "I regret that our meeting comes under such sorrowful circumstances. Your aunt's passing is a terrible loss." Freda's lips pressed together, a shadow flickered across her face. "Poor auntie," she murmured, lowering her gaze. "I've been wishing all morning that I'd been more patient. Kinder." Radnor made a sound of protest. "Freda, you stood a great deal." "Yes, Jacob," but she exhaled sharply, her fingers clenching at her skirt. "I have a temper, I know. I get sharp when I shouldn't. And auntie, well, she could be difficult. She had these ideas, wild ideas." She hesitated, then met Poirot's eyes with a flicker of defiance. She convinced herself that uncle was poisoning her. Poirot said nothing. He merely inclined his head, inviting her to continue. "It was nonsense, of course," she added hurriedly. She always felt worse after something he gave her, but that was just in her head. She made up her mind she would be ill, and then she was, that's all. Her voice was steady, but there was something in her tone, something too insistent, too rehearsed. I caught Poirot's glance, subtle yet weighted with meaning. Radnor stepped closer, his presence protective. "It's cruel," he said, his voice low but firm. "The rumors, the whispering, it needs to stop. Edward Pengelly did nothing wrong. He loved his wife." Poirot tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "So you believe Monsieur?" he said softly. A silence stretched between them. Then Radnor exhaled sharply and turned away, staring out of the window. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavy with things left unsaid. Poirot, as if sensing he had gleaned all he needed, inclined his head. "Mercy, Mademoiselle Stanton, you have been most helpful." As we stepped outside, the crisp morning air felt oddly charged, as if the town itself held its breath. Poirot adjusted his hat, his face pensive. "Hastings," he murmured, "that young woman, she believes what she says, but she also fears it may not be true." He glanced back toward the house, "And as for Monsieur Radnor, he is a man with secrets." I shivered, though the sun had begun to rise higher in the sky. Poirot had promised the truth would emerge. I feared we were only just beginning to uncover it. "What was the actual cause of your disagreement, mademoiselle?" Miss Freda Stanton hesitated, her dark eyes flickering towards Radnor. It was the briefest of glances, but it spoke volumes. The young man, astute enough to recognize the silent request, stepped back and retrieved his hat from the side table. "I must be going, Freda. I'll see you this evening." His voice was smooth, carefully neutral. Then with a glance at us he added, "Off to the station, gentlemen." Poirot, ever polite, inclined his head. "Just so, monsieur." Radnor gave a curt nod before stepping out, his departure punctuated by the soft click of the door. Poirot wasted no time. He turned back to Miss Stanton, watching her closely, his head slightly tilted. "You are affianced, is it not so?" His tone was light, almost teasing, but his eyes were sharp. A delicate flush crept up Freda's cheeks. "Yes," she admitted. "And this perhaps was the cause of your troubles with your aunt." She let out a small, uneasy laugh. "I suppose you could say that." She did not approve of the match? Not exactly. The hesitation was back. A hesitation filled with something unsaid. Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Mademoiselle, it is often in the details that the truth is found, and the truth, I sense, is not so simple." Freda exhaled sharply, twisting her hands in her lap. It feels cruel to say it, especially now, but you'll never understand unless I tell you. Auntie was infatuated with Jacob. The words hung in the air, unnatural, uncomfortable. Poirot's eyebrows lifted, though his expression remained otherwise unreadable. Infatuated, you say? Frida nodded quickly, a mixture of embarrassment and exasperation flickering across her face. Yes, it was absurd, wasn't it? She was over 50, and Jacob, he's not even 30 yet, but she was silly about him, always inviting him over, always fussing over him. I suppose she thought she was being subtle, but it was obvious. Poirot folded his arms, his expression thoughtful, and when she learned that his affections lay elsewhere, Frida's face darkened. She refused to believe it. She accused me of twisting things, of making it all up. She called me a liar, said Jacob was only being kind to me, out of pity. She let out a bitter laugh. Can you imagine? As if I couldn't tell the difference. As if I was a child who didn't know her own heart. She shook her head, her expression momentarily distant, before she snapped back to the present. I was furious. I told her exactly what I thought. And well, we argued. A lot. In the end, Jacob and I decided it was best if I left for a while, just until she came to her senses. I never thought. Her voice caught. Poirot studied her for a moment, before speaking gently. You never thought she would not have the time to come to her senses. Frida swallowed hard, her eyes dropping to her lap. No, I didn't. For the first time, her voice held a tremor. Whatever her frustrations with her aunt had been, there was grief too, perhaps mingled with something else, something close to guilt. Poirot gave a small nod, his tone shifting to something lighter. Thank you, mademoiselle, you have been most helpful. She nodded mutely, but Poirot's gaze lingered on her for a fraction longer than necessary, as if seeing more than she was willing to say. As we stepped outside, the cool morning air was bracing against the tension of the room we had just left. The sky had begun to pale into the soft grays of an overcast day, but there, standing just beyond the threshold, was an unmistakable figure, Jacob Radnor, waiting. His hands were in his pockets, his face unreadable, but there was something in the way he stood, something in the way his eyes flickered between us, that told me one thing. He wanted to know what we knew. Poirot, ever the master of subtlety, straightened his cuffs and stepped forward. His voice when he spoke was calm, almost conversational. Monsieur Radnor, how very fortunate. I was hoping we might speak again. Radnor's jaw tightened just slightly, his hands pressing deeper into his coat pockets. Were you? Poirot smiled, and just like that I knew. This mystery was far from over. Radnor exhaled sharply, his gaze shifting towards the cobbled street, as if considering his words carefully before he spoke. When he finally did, his voice was measured, almost too controlled. I can guess pretty well what Frida has been telling you, he said, his eyes flicking back to us. The whole situation was unfortunate, awkward, to say the least. You can imagine what it was like for me. But let me make one thing clear, none of it was my doing. At first I thought the old woman was simply looking out for Frida and me, helping things along, but then it turned into something else entirely. It became uncomfortable. There was a slight tick at the corner of his jaw as he said the word. Poirot did not miss it. Uncomfortable. Poirot repeated softly, his head tilting in that bird-like way of his. Radnor's lips pressed together momentarily, then with an almost imperceptible shake of the head, he dismissed the thought. Never mind, it's over now. And when do you and Miss Stanton plan to marry? Poirot's voice was light, casual, but the question was anything but. Radnor's fingers twitched slightly at his side before he folded his arms across his chest. Soon, I hope. Then taking a small step forward, his voice lowered, gaining an edge of something steely, something more deliberate. Look, Poirot, I'll be honest with you, I know more than Frida does. Poirot said nothing. He merely waited. Radnor continued, his voice quieter now, almost a murmur. She thinks her uncle is innocent. I'm not so sure, but let me tell you something. I don't intend to say a word about what I do know. Some things are better left buried. What good would it do, dragging this all out into the open? The poor woman is gone. Nothing can change that. Do you think she'd have wanted a scandal? He let out a short, humorless laugh. She'd be horrified at the mere thought of it. Poirot studied him, his expression unreadable. And so you wish for me to remain silent? Radnor nodded, his jaw set. That's exactly what I want. I'll be blunt. I have no interest in justice, in setting the record straight, or in uncovering the truth. I have my life to think about. I'm building up a good business, a future with Frida. I won't let this ruin everything. Poirot regarded him thoughtfully for a moment before speaking, his voice even. Most of us are selfish, Mr. Radnor, but not all of us admit it so freely. Radnor's mouth twitched slightly, but he said nothing. Poirot continued, his words slow, deliberate. Very well, I will do as you ask. Radnor exhaled, relief flashing across his face, but before he could speak, Poirot added, his tone almost conversational. Almost. But let me tell you something, monsieur. Secrets have a way of slipping through the cracks. No matter how tightly you think you have sealed them away, they will find their way out. Radnor's relief faded, his face darkened, his hands clenching at his sides. Poirot smiled faintly. You may try to hush it up, but you will not succeed. For the first time Radnor looked truly uneasy, and in that moment, I saw it, the flicker of something deeper in his eyes, a shadow of something not yet spoken, and I knew, whatever truth lay beneath all of this, we had only scratched the surface. Why not? Poirot lifted a single finger, his sharp eyes glinting with something unreadable. We were passing the town's bustling market, the air thick with the chatter of merchants and buyers, the scent of fresh produce mingling with the more acrid smells of livestock and damp earth. Voices rose and fell, a chaotic symphony of daily life. The voice of the people, mon ami. That is why, he murmured, one cannot silence it forever. Radnor stiffened almost imperceptibly, but before he could respond, Poirot glanced at his pocket watch. Ah, but we must run, or we shall miss our train. A minute later we were seated in our carriage, the train steaming out of the station. Poirot, ever meticulous, retrieved a small comb from his pocket, along with a minuscule mirror, and set about adjusting his mustache. The symmetry, he claimed, had suffered during our hurried departure. I watched him with a mixture of amusement and exasperation. You seem to find this whole affair fascinating, I said, shaking my head. But of course, Hastings, it is most intriguing. To me it's all rather sordid and unpleasant, I admitted. There's hardly any mystery in it at all. Poirot's lips curled slightly. Just so, there is no mystery whatsoever. I frowned. I suppose we can accept the girl's extraordinary story about her aunt's infatuation. That was the only part that struck me as odd. She seemed such a respectable woman. Poirot replaced his cup, folded his arms, and leaned back with the air of a man about to deliver a lecture. Ah, Hastings, you see but you do not observe. There is nothing extraordinary in it. Quite the contrary, it is entirely natural. You read the newspapers, do you not? You have seen the accounts, respectable women, wives, mothers, leaving behind lives they have built over decades to follow some young man who has caught their fancy. A moment of madness, as fleeting as it is inevitable. I raised an eyebrow. But why? Why would a woman like that risk everything? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Because, mon ami, there comes a time in every woman's life, a moment, a single dangerous moment, when she longs for romance, for adventure, before it is too late, before she fades entirely into the shadows of old age and regret. The quietest, most respectable woman is not immune to it. It is, how shall we say, the final rebellion of youth before it is gone forever. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. And you think? Poirot nodded, his expression darkening, that a clever man, a man with ambition but little scruple, might recognize such a moment, and exploit it. A chill passed through me. Suddenly I recalled Radnor's careful words, his insistence that the past should remain buried, his discomfort, his urgency. But Poirot, I said slowly, if this was merely a case of misplaced infatuation, why do I feel that we are still missing something? Poirot tapped a finger against his chin, his gaze distant. Because, mon ami, we are. I wouldn't call Pengelly particularly clever, I mused, watching the countryside roll past in a blur of green and gold. He's got the whole town gossiping about him, and yet I suppose you're right. The only two men who know anything, Radnor and the doctor, both want to keep silent. Somehow, he's managed that. I only wish we'd seen the fellow ourselves. Poirot gave a small knowing smile. You can still indulge your wish, mon ami. Return by the next train, and present yourself with a most painful molar. A simple toothache should suffice to secure an appointment. I looked at him keenly. I wish I knew exactly what you found so interesting about this case. Ah, Poirot said, steepling his fingers. My interest, Hastings, is perfectly summed up by a remark of yours. Do you recall what you said after our interview with the maid? You observed that, for someone who was determined not to speak, she had in fact said a great deal. I frowned, trying to piece it together. Oh, I said, though not entirely convinced. Then I circled back to the question that had been nagging at me. Still, I can't quite understand why you didn't try to see Pengelly himself. Poirot's eyes twinkled, but his voice when he spoke was flat and matter-of-fact. Mon ami, I give him just 3 months, and then I shall see him for as long as I please, in the dock. I laughed, shaking my head. Poirot had a way of making such bold proclamations, but this time, I felt sure he was mistaken. 3 months. Surely if Pengelly had done something nefarious, he would have been exposed by now. And yet, time passed. The case faded into the background, drowned out by other matters. The Cornish affair became just another curiosity, half remembered, until one morning, my memory was jolted into sharp focus by a brief but startling paragraph in the newspaper. An order for the exhumation of Mrs. Pengelly's body has been granted by the Home Secretary. I lowered the paper slowly. So Poirot had been right after all. What followed was a storm of public intrigue. The case that had been little more than a whisper of scandal suddenly erupted into full-blown headlines. Gossip in the town had never truly died down, and when Mr. Pengelly's engagement to his secretary, Miss Marks, was announced, the hushed murmur was turned into an uproar. Tongues wagged, old suspicions resurfaced, and soon a petition was sent to the Home Secretary. The authorities had no choice but to act. The body was exhumed. The results were damning. Large quantities of arsenic were discovered in Mrs. Pengelly's remains. Within days her husband was arrested and formally charged with murder. Poirot and I attended the preliminary proceedings, the courtroom packed to the rafters with eager spectators. The evidence unfolded in chilling detail. Dr. Adams hesitantly admitted that arsenic poisoning could in some cases be mistaken for a gastric ailment. The Home Office expert delivered his findings with cold, clinical precision. The maid Jessie, who had initially seemed reluctant to speak, now poured out a flood of information, some of it discarded as mere hearsay, but much of it reinforcing the prosecution's case. And then there was Frida Stanton. She took the stand, her face pale but her voice steady. Her testimony was damning. Auntie always felt worse after eating food my uncle prepared. She was certain he was poisoning her. I thought she was imagining things, but now her voice caught, but she composed herself. Now I know she was right. A shiver ran down my spine. I turned to Poirot, but he was already watching Pengelly, studying him as if he were an insect under a magnifying glass. And for the first time I noticed something unsettling about the man in the dock. Something not quite fear, nor even remorse, something closer to resignation. Poirot leaned in and whispered, "Ah, Hastings, now at last we shall see whether the guilty man is truly the one in the prisoner's chair." And with that cryptic remark, the trial continued. Jacob Radnor took the stand, his expression unreadable as he recounted the events of that fateful day. He had dropped by unexpectedly, he said, just hours before Mrs. Pengelly's death. The house had been quiet, eerily so. As he stepped inside, he found Mr. Pengelly standing in the dim pantry, carefully replacing a bottle of weed killer on the shelf. His movements were precise, almost deliberate, as if making sure everything was exactly as it should be. On the table nearby sat a bowl of gruel, still warm, Mrs. Pengelly's gruel. The courtroom stirred with hushed whispers. The weight of Radnor's statement settled like a thick fog over the proceedings. Was it coincidence, or had he just described the final damning act of a cold-blooded murderer? Then came Miss Marks, the fair-haired secretary. Her presence sent a ripple through the crowd. She looked pale, fragile, until the questioning began. Almost immediately she dissolved into hysteria, her sobs echoing off the wooden walls. She gasped for breath between choked confessions, admitting to passages between herself and Pengelly. He had promised to marry her, she blurted out, in the event that anything happened to his wife. The phrase lingered in the air like a death knell. Pengelly's face remained unreadable. When asked for his defense, he simply shook his head. He would reserve it for trial. The gavel came down, he was bound over, and the murmurs of the crowd swelled like a restless sea. Later, as we walked back to our lodgings, Jacob Radnor accompanied us, his steps heavy with thought. Poirot glanced at him with that keen knowing look of his. "You see, Mr. Radnor," he said at last, "I was right. The voice of the people has spoken, and not in whispers. There was never a chance of hushing this case up." Radnor sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "You were quite right. But tell me, Poirot, do you think there's any chance of him getting off?" Poirot gave a small enigmatic smile. "Well, he has reserved his defense. Perhaps he has something up the sleeves, as you English say." He gestured towards our lodgings. "Come inside with us, will you not?" Radnor hesitated, then nodded. Inside I ordered 2 whiskies and sodas, while Poirot, true to form, requested a cup of hot chocolate. The waiter's bewilderment was almost comical, and I had serious doubts whether the order would ever arrive. Poirot leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled, his eyes gleaming with some private thought. "Of course," he said, in his most conversational tone, "I have a good deal of experience in such matters, and I see only one loophole of escape for our unfortunate friend." Radnor stiffened. "What do you mean?" Poirot swirled his spoon in the air, as if stirring invisible clues together. "Ah, mon ami," he murmured, "let us just say that the truth has a most peculiar way of revealing itself, especially when one is determined to keep it buried." And with that he took a sip of his chocolate, a satisfied gleam in his eye. Radnor's face barely changed as he glanced at the sheet of paper Poirot had so effortlessly conjured. His fingers, however, twitched slightly. It was the only indication of unease. "What is it?" he asked again, his voice carefully controlled. "A confession," Poirot said softly. "A full admission that you murdered Mrs. Pengelly." There was silence, so absolute that I could hear the clock on the mantel ticking away the seconds. Then suddenly Radnor laughed. It was a sharp, almost mocking sound. "You must be mad," he scoffed, shaking his head. "Why on earth would I sign such nonsense?" Poirot, unperturbed, simply smiled. His fingers traced the edges of the paper, smoothing it over as though it were a mere formality. "No, mon ami, I am not mad," he said lightly. "But you, perhaps. You are a man who took a great gamble. You came to this town, set up a little business, tried to make your fortune. But fortune did not smile on you, did it?" Poirot leaned forward, his sharp gaze pinning Radnor in place. "You needed money, desperately. And Mr. Pengelly, he was a man of considerable means, was he not?" Radnor said nothing, his hand clenched subtly at his side, and then Poirot continued, his voice a delicate whisper. "There was his niece, a charming girl. She was inclined to smile upon you, I think. But what was a smile when her inheritance was so little? No, you needed more than that. And so you devised a most elaborate plan, mon cher. You played the long game. You needed to remove both the uncle and the aunt. Only then would the real wealth flow into your beloved's hands, and from her hands to yours." I watched Radnor closely. He was no longer smirking. A shadow flickered across his face, something almost imperceptible, but Poirot saw it. Poirot always saw it. "You were patient," Poirot mused. "So patient. You gained Mrs. Pengelly's trust. You made her believe that you were her ally. You whispered doubts into her mind, one by one. At first you made her suspect her husband of deceit, a mistress, a betrayal. It was easy to plant such seeds, was it not?" Poirot chuckled softly. "But that was not enough. You had to go further. You made her believe that he wanted her dead, poisoned, murdered." Radnor's breathing had slowed, his eyes darted to the door, just for a second, a flicker of calculation. Poirot noticed. "You were often in the house," Poirot said smoothly. "You had access to the food, to the kitchen. It was not difficult for you to introduce arsenic into her meals, but you were clever. You never did it when Mr. Pengelly was away. Non, that would be too obvious. You made sure that whenever she fell ill, it was after a meal her husband had been near. A brilliant touch, truly. Her own paranoia did the rest of the work for you. Radnor's lips parted slightly, as if he meant to say something, but he remained silent. She did not keep her fears to herself. Poirot pressed on, his voice a low hypnotic rhythm. No woman does, when she is afraid. She told her niece. She confided in friends. She spoke her doom into existence. Poirot tilted his head, watching Radnor's expression with the sharp curiosity of a cat watching a trapped mouse. Your only challenge was maintaining your double game, he continued. The aunt and the niece, 2 women, one deceived, the other charmed, but even that was not so difficult, was it? You simply told Mrs. Pengelly that you had to pretend to court her niece, to throw off suspicions, and as for the niece, Poirot's smile was razor-sharp. She never even considered the possibility that her dear sweet aunt might be her rival. Radnor let out a slow breath. His hand moved toward the paper, but he stopped just short of touching it. Poirot's eyes gleamed. So tell me, mon ami, he whispered, will you sign? Radnor's face was a mask of forced indifference, but his fingers clenched at his sides. Poirot, seated ever so comfortably, tapped the paper lightly, his gaze unwavering. You see, monsieur, your little game was clever, but not clever enough. Poirot's voice was light, almost amused. You thought Mrs. Pengelly was your puppet, utterly under your control. You planted fear in her heart, whispers of poison, betrayal. But then, she took a step you did not foresee. She sought me out. She wanted certainty. If she could be sure, beyond doubt, that her husband meant to harm her, she would leave him. And to whom would she turn? Why, to you, of course. That is what she believed. Poirot leaned forward, his fingers steepled. But that did not suit you, did it? His voice was softer now, edged with steel. A detective prying into matters, that could ruin everything. You needed to act. And so when the moment presented itself, when Mr. Pengelly, unsuspecting, prepared his wife's gruel, you saw your chance. You were there, weren't you? The pantry door ajar, the shadows hiding your movements. Just a pinch of arsenic, quick and unseen, a final dose, and then, the inevitable, the end of Mrs. Pengelly. Radnor's face was stark white, but still he managed to sneer. Very dramatic, he said coldly, but where is your proof? Poirot only smiled. Proof, he mused. Ah, monsieur, that is such a tedious thing, is it not? I could tell the police what I know, but what is knowledge without evidence? Would a jury believe me simply because I am Hercule Poirot? Perhaps not, but you see—
I do not need a jury.
I need only you. And with that, he slid the paper across the table. A confession, monsieur, your escape. A bargain, if you will. Radnor's breath hitched, but he forced a scoff. You expect me to sign this? I do. And in return you have 24 hours. 24 hours of freedom before I turn this in to the police. Radnor hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the door, then the window. You have no way to stop me from leaving right now. His voice was strained but defiant. Poirot's smile widened. Look outside, monsieur. Radnor strode to the window, flinging the curtain aside, and there in the street below, 2 men loitered, seemingly idle, but their eyes were fixed on the house. Radnor stepped back abruptly, a curse slipping from his lips. You see, Poirot said smoothly, you are already caught, but I offer you a choice. Sign, and you may go, for now. If you run, Scotland Yard will find you. If you stay, well, we shall see what fate has in store. Radnor's fingers trembled as they hovered over the pen. A long silence stretched between us. Then, at last, with a curse under his breath, he scrawled his name. Poirot nodded approvingly. Hastings, the left-hand blind, if you please. Halfway up. That is our signal that he may go. Radnor did not wait. He turned sharply and strode from the room, muttering under his breath. As the door slammed shut, I turned to Poirot, my frustration boiling over. You let him go, I said angrily. You always speak against sentiment, but this is sheer recklessness. A murderer, walking free, because of your little game. Poirot merely chuckled, adjusting his cuffs. Ah, Hastings, mon ami, you see but you do not observe. Did we have proof? No. Would the law have acted on my suspicions alone? Certainly not. But fear, fear is a marvelous thing. A guilty man given time will always betray himself. And Radnor, He is a coward, he will run, and when he does, Scotland Yard will have him. He stood, his little frame exuding quiet satisfaction. 24 hours, my friend, 24 hours of borrowed time, and then justice will come knocking. You have my word on that.